All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our third session of our RESEA Evidence Building Week. We appreciate you being here with us. Next slide, please. Before we begin, we do have a few tips that will help orient you to the webinar and how to best interact with our panelists and also with our guests from the States. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. That's to help limit background noise and anything of that nature. Please, we're asking that you use the chat feature to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties at any time during the webinar. Please also use the chat to submit your questions. We are looking forward to your questions. We are here as the speakers and as the panelists to assist you throughout this time of our presentation. So please use that chat feature to type in your questions, and you can do that at any point during the presentation. And then one more note is that this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available at a later date. Next slide, please. In this session, we're going to hear from US DOL staff about the federal perspective on evidence. Then the evaluation TA team will share an overview of what we know already from the RESEA evaluations. We'll also discuss with state panelists what they are learning from their RESEA evaluations. Next slide, please. I'm Eric Davenport. I'm a workforce development specialist with the reemployment team within the Office of Unemployment Insurance. My responsibilities include providing and developing technical assistance for states operating the RESEA program. Prior to joining DOL in August of 2022, I was a program analyst with the state of Michigan. I was working with internal and external partners at that time, assisting in growing and implementing the RESEA program. I'm joined today by Evan Murphy, an evaluation specialist with the U.S. Department of Labor's Chief Evaluation Office. Evan manages a variety of evaluation projects aimed at building evidence about DOL programs, including the RESEA Evidence Building and Implementation Study and the RESEA Evidence Building Portfolio Project. From the RESEA Evaluation Technical Assistance Team, we are joined today by Andrew Clark-West, co-principal investigator for the RESEA Evidence Building and Implementation Study Project. Next slide, please. And we are thrilled to have panelists from 3 different states joining us today. Kathy Cedillo has been a program coordinator for the RESEA program in the state of Nebraska for 2.5 years. Prior to her current role, Kathy was a reemployment coordinator for the Trade and Dislocated Worker programs. She has been with the state of Nebraska Department of Labor since 2016, where she also worked on the unemployment side as a claims specialist and as an adjudicator. We have Eric Carrillo also joining us today, currently serving as the interim administrator for the reemployment services at the Nebraska Department of Labor. In this role, he oversees the FLC, RESEA, and WOTC programs. He brings with him experience as a program analyst, data analyst for the past 2 years. Jen Adams served as the program coordinator of the RESEA program for the state of Missouri. She began working with the Division of Employment Security in 2008 in the Regional Claims Center. She's been part of the RESEA program management team since 2014, developing training and policy and providing guidance to all staff involved in the program, including DES and Missouri Job Center staff. Sarah Bramblett is currently the Assistant Director who works of Workforce Development Services, overseeing Rhode Island's federally funded workforce development programs, as well as the state's American Job Center systems. Prior to this role, she oversaw the healthcare sector investment programs with the Economic Development Platform, Real Jobs Rhode Island. And finally, Megan Swindoll is the Director of Data and Performance at the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training, where she manages various data projects across the agency in collaboration with internal and external partners. Next slide, please. At this time, we're going to provide a poll. We'd like to know who is all with us today, so we encourage you to respond to the poll that is popping up on your screen now. Select the response that best corresponds to your organizational affiliation. We'll take about a few moments just to give you an opportunity to answer that, and then we'll look at the results. And as we indicated, as we're waiting for the results to come in, we appreciate our state panelists joining us today. We appreciate those that are joining us to ask questions, listen in, and learn on how they can increase and what they can do for their evaluation in their states. It does appear that our poll is slowing down at this time, so we'll go ahead and close that out and take a look. And we have 60% of our attendees are state UI or RESEA. We have about 22% that are evaluator or research. And then the rest fall into the other categories. So thank you for taking that time. We do have one other poll that we would ask for you to participate in. And our second poll is, how would you prefer to learn about new evidence coming out of states' RESEA evaluations? And again, I'll give you a few moments to be able to respond, and then we'll take a quick look at the results of this poll. I do see that our poll is becoming or coming down to an end. So let's go ahead and we'll close this poll out and take a quick look. And 35% of those in attendance are asking for webinars. 21% are asking for emails with short evidence summaries. 18% are interactive peer learning sessions. And then 14% are asking for detailed reports. And then the rest fall within the other categories. And so thank you for taking a few moments to answer and give us an idea of where you're from. Give us an idea of how you'd like to learn more about other states' RESEA evaluations. And so with that said, at this time now, I'd like to turn things over to Evan Murphy.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate that. And thank you everyone for taking that poll. It's really great to see what people are looking for from us with providing the latest on RESEA. So I'm just going to briefly speak about the federal perspective on RESEA evidence. Next slide, please. Just give you a little bit of background on evaluations and evidence building. We discussed yesterday in session 2 that evaluation is a tool or a method. Start my video, my apologies. Evaluation is a tool or a method we use to learn about RESEA programs. We learn about who they serve, how they operate, the context in which they operate, and what services are effective and why they are effective. We can think about evaluation as a process of evidence refinement in which we take raw data, such as from survey of program participants, administrative data records, interviews with program staff. We take that data, we do a systematic analysis in order to generate a set of findings that answer our important research questions. Evaluation is an important way to build evidence about interventions. And although one single study could contribute to the evidence about a program, it takes a breadth of evidence to really come to strong conclusions. Next slide, please. So one evaluation may provide us some understanding of what happens under a single context, about one intervention, but multiple studies conducted over time and in different contexts can help us understand and build evidence about the effectiveness of a program model more generally and across contexts and populations. Multiple studies can help us hone in on what works for whom and under what circumstances. Next slide. Evaluation is just one type of evidence, but evidence is more than just evaluation. You can think about performance data analysis, literature reviews as other forms of evidence that provide us a more clear picture. Together, they all help build a larger body of evidence. Next slide. Evidence is valuable for informing policy and program design decisions so that programs can better serve participants and resources can be used effectively and efficiently. The Department of Labor values and appreciates all the efforts that states are making to evaluate their RESEA programs. We know it's not easy to get evaluations up and running, but the work you're doing is so important. Over time, and as we all complete more evaluations, produce reports that cycle into new evaluations, we will all learn what is more effective for RESEA and help unemployed individuals get back to work. This information will help improve this and strengthen the RESEA program at the state and federal levels. Next slide. Excited for today. We're going to hear about several states and their evaluations. We're going to find out what they're learning and how they plan to use that information. As the states in this virtual room know, it takes time to plan and launch evaluations and more time for results to become available. While we do not have any reports from states' RESEA evaluations publicly available on CLEAR yet, we know that several evaluations are forthcoming. So we want to encourage you all to continue to visit CLEAR for updates. We're actually in the middle of a redesign of our website. We want to add this section, as you can see on the screen here, which is going to promote the most recent and emerging findings from RESEA evaluations. Next slide. With that, I want to turn it over to Andrew Clark-West from the Evaluation Technical Assistance team at APT, who's going to provide an overview of the state of the evidence of RESEA right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Evan. And I apologize. I think I inadvertently cleared my throat in the middle of your talking. That's not be a commentary. But as Evan was saying, for the process of ongoing evidence-based program improvement, states nationwide need access to credible evidence on how effective different RESEA program design elements and strategies are, so that you know kind of, okay, this is a more effective versus less effective way to do things, or is it worth investing in, adding particular services or not? So I'm going to talk briefly about the evidence that's available from published studies, as well as evidence that will become available from evaluations that states are conducting now, from what we know about states' current evaluation activity. Next. So we have some insights already on programs and services like those delivered through RESEA, which provide a foundation for further information that we'll learn from states' evaluations as those begin to emerge. Here I'm going to briefly share some findings from the Reemployment and Eligibility Assessment, aka REA impact evaluation. Most of you know that REA was the predecessor program to RESEA, and two sets of evaluation examined its impact in a handful of states. I'll also share some new preliminary insights from recent efforts by our evaluation TA team to revisit the existing evidence base. And lastly, I'll share some findings from the RESEA implementation study that was published last year. So the impact evaluations of REA that I mentioned found that states' programs tended to improve UI claimants' short-term employment outcomes and also reduce the UI duration. That's consistent with the program's goals, so that was excellent news. But when you look across studies using a technique called meta-analysis, one thing you find is that there is real and meaningful difference in how large of an impact different states' programs have. One other point to note is that programs have typically only been able to select a subset of claimants for RESEA, although with increases in funding, I know more states are in a position to select all claimants now, particularly with relatively low unemployment rates. But assuming that's not always going to be the case, and is not the case for all states, that states historically to determine which claimants to select rely on profiling scores, which statistically estimate claimants' risk of benefit exhaustion. And although larger sample sizes are needed to detect how impacts differ across subgroups of claimants, from the data that were available from REA, those evaluations did not find evidence of larger program impacts for claimants with higher profiling scores than for claimants with lower profiling scores. Next. And these results highlight some broad learning priorities for RESEA. Those include, why is it that some states' programs have had particularly large impacts? To what extent is it about the design of those programs, their labor market context, or the population served? And a question that is related to that is, how can RESEA programs be designed to be most effective? What is the best way to deploy the resources or available program resources to meet RESEA program goals? Then finally, in cases where a state's RESEA program does not have resources to serve all eligible UI claimants, how can we tell which claimants most need services available through RESEA, which would help inform which claimants make the most sense to target for the program? Next. So forthcoming evidence from states' evaluations, the evaluations that you all are conducting now, of the impact of specific program components, as well as how impacts vary among subgroups, will of course ultimately be key to answering those questions. But REA evaluations did lay some groundwork here. As I mentioned, they did conduct some analyses of how program impacts vary across claimants of different backgrounds. They also began examining some program components. For instance, findings from multi-state REA evaluations found that adding subsequent meetings did appear to increase programs' impacts on UI duration. Seems like that likely has spurred additional interest in using subsequent meetings. And at a broad level, the analyses also indicated that RESEA programs' impacts are the result both of the services that claimants receive through the program, as well as the requirement to attend. So one key challenge for RESEA programs is achieving high meeting attendance rates so that claimants can actually receive the intended services. There's not a ton of research on how to promote higher meeting attendance rates, although we know a number of states are working on that, as I'll mention later. But there was one study of REA in Michigan that found that reminder emails that used behaviorally informed wording did increase meeting attendance rates, which is a promising early finding that can be built on in subsequent work. And of course, beyond that, there are many more elements of RESEA to potentially learn about that could generate insights into ways to continue to improve RESEA programs. Next. One source of additional evidence on RESEA relevant strategies is the wider body of existing reemployment evidence that's been developed over the last roughly 3 decades. That evidence was summarized in an evidence synthesis created by CLEAR, which led to the existing set of rated intervention categories on CLEAR. But those intervention rating categories were created before the 2018 RESEA evidence requirements were put into place, and they aren't necessarily tuned to the specific interest that DOL and RESEA program administrators have in identifying effective program components. The categories are pretty broad, and the interventions that they contain inside of each category are varied and include evidence on both multifaceted interventions as well as on narrower program components. Next. So one thing our team is doing is revisiting that evidence base to tease out, see what more detailed information on component impacts can be teased out from the existing evidence base, as well as to add more recently published evidence. We're in the middle of that right now, but we have found that studies published to date do include evidence on interventions that are core or at least common components of RESEA, like subsequent meetings, employment services registration, customized one-on-one JSA, job search workshops, and referrals to reemployment services. We're also capturing whether the services that were evaluated are voluntary or mandatory. That's consistent with the finding I noted earlier that a program's impacts can result both from the services themselves as well as the mandate to participate. So it makes it helpful to understand when you're looking at prior evidence whether the component that was evaluated was a mandated component or not. Or at least I should say mandated, that it was mandated for the claimants to participate, or whether it was entirely voluntary on their end. All right, next slide. As I think you all are probably well aware, by this point, DOL also strongly encourages states to conduct implementation studies, not just impact studies of their RESEA programs. As part of the RESEA evidence building and implementation study, Apt Associates, the Urban Institute, and Capital Research Corporation conducted a nationwide implementation study of RESEA. We collected information through web-based surveys of all RESEA administrators nationwide, and we also conducted interviews with state and local staff from 10 states. And finally, we conducted analyses of state RESEA plans and ETA 9128 reports. So that work is broad, has a number of sources. It might not be quite as in-depth at the level of any individual state as if you all, the implementation studies that you all might conduct within your own states. But the work did help identify ways that states' programs varied. Some of those key aspects included how much staff time is used for each initial meeting, the number of subsequent meetings that programs have, if any, the staffing approaches that states use, whether they use dedicated staff, to what extent they use partner staff versus or partner programs in the AJC versus just UI staff, things like that. Also, we found variation in the strategies used to promote meeting attendance, as well as uptake of partner services that claimants are referred to. And relatedly, the consequences for failure to attend meetings. So all of those are things that states do in different ways. That indicates some areas where states might be able to adopt strategies from other states' programs. And as of early 2020, states have reported making few program changes since RESEA's permanent authorization in 2018. Of course, they hadn't had a lot of time by that point. And I know COVID got in a way of a lot of things that states might have wanted to do for a decent while. But state program administrators did express interest in making program changes in a number of areas, including ways to enhance the extent and customization of reemployment services that claimants receive, as well as changes to the criteria used to select claimants for RESEA. Next slide. And these findings of ways that states' programs vary and areas where states would like to implement new strategies do also raise possible priority topics that evaluations could focus on to build new evidence on program strategies. Here we list some examples that we mentioned in the RESEA implementation report, which include looking at the number, timing, and venue of RESEA meetings, ways to integrate with the broader workforce system, and ways to enhance reemployment services provision. Possible evaluation topics in that first category include looking at initial meeting timing, whether it's best to schedule meetings somewhat earlier or somewhat later in the claim. And of course, with remote and virtual services having become so much more common since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, another topic of interest, I know to DOL in a lot of states, is how holding meetings remotely affects outcomes relative to holding them in person. And includes how do remote services affect RESEA meeting attendance, participants' take-up of referrals, and ultimately their employment and UI claim duration outcomes. And to the extent that remote services have any disadvantages relative to in-person services, an important question is how might those issues be ameliorated? Next slide. So there are many things yet to be learned about effective RESEA interventions that can be valuable for informing program improvement efforts. And states' evidence building activity is beginning to fill a number of those gaps. States nationwide, we know, are at various stages of planning for and conducting evaluations, including a couple of evaluations that have wrapped up. And many states are conducting or plan to conduct evaluations of their programs as a whole, of course. Those will provide a substantial body of rigorous evidence on the overall effectiveness of RESEA, which is great. And also it's worth mentioning that to the extent that states are conducting whole program impact evaluations and are also able to share careful details of program context and operations from implementation studies, as well as share their data analysis files publicly with DOL, that will make it more possible to learn not just about overall program impacts, but by looking across those studies, looking at how the impacts vary, looking at how the programs and their context varies, also figure out what are the distinguishing characteristics of effective programs. So there's more detailed information that can be teased out of those evaluations. But of course, the most direct and rigorous way to understand which approaches contribute to more effective programs is to conduct evaluations of the effectiveness of specific program components. And many states are doing just that. Our latest survey that we administered this summer, thanks to everybody for responding to that. I think we have all but one state having responded to that now. Those responses are, the responses on this chart are the number of states indicating that they plan to or are in the midst of conducting an evaluation of, or I should say an impact evaluation of one or more program components. This is a list of the components that they say that they plan to evaluate. Some of those are related to how to select claimants. Others are related to meeting attendance, the number or mode of RESEA meetings, and approaches to providing reemployment services. A total of 9 states report planning to evaluate approaches to reduce failure to report. That's the most common one. Those might include strategies informed by behavioral science. Other important or other common interventions and planned component evaluations include subsequent RESEA meetings and the relative impact of services provided remotely versus in person. Finally, a number of states are examining reemployment services and ways to enhance them. Those include examining the effect of adding required job search workshops or ways to provide more individualized or intensive career services. And in some cases, those include developing additional touch points for caseworkers to interact with claimants that aren't full RESEA meetings per se, but allow caseworkers to check in on claimants' job search progress and needs and connect them to additional services or opportunities that are consistent with those needs. Next. All right, with that, I'm going to stop talking and give you the chance to hear about experiences and lessons from staff from some states that have substantial experience with their RESEA evaluations. So I'd like to welcome Jen, Kathy, Eric, Sarah, and Megan. And if they're all on the line, I'm going to start by pitching a question to Jen from Missouri. Jen, your evaluation had an interesting combination of research questions. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake first. Before I introduce them, forgot that I do have some slides to introduce before that, with brief overviews of what their evaluations consisted of. So we're going to hear from staff from Nebraska, Missouri, and Rhode Island. Nebraska's evaluation had both impact and implementation components. The implementation study focused on how staff assess clients' needs, barriers, successes, and interventions, as well as basically who are the participants in RESEA and UI. The impact questions examined how does the program improve participants, or not the program, in this case, there's a follow-up meeting after the initial meeting. How does that affect UI claim length, participants' income, and their employment retention? So Missouri's RESEA evaluation, they're doing a randomized controlled trial with impact study, and again, also an implementation study. They're looking at overall impacts, including does the program improve participant employment rates and earnings and reduce UI duration and the benefit amounts collected. They're also looking at the program's cost effectiveness, as well as how much it matters if RESEA meetings are conducted earlier versus later in the claim. And then Rhode Island is conducting 2 types of impact studies. One of them historically, so a retrospective analysis of how RESEA selection affected wages, reemployment, and time spent on UI pre-pandemic between 2016 and 2019, as well as a prospective impact evaluation of RESEA's impacts on wages, reemployment, and time spent on UI post-pandemic. I said Nebraska's evaluation is completed. Rhode Island has completed their historical impact study and are working on their current impact study. Missouri's, I think, are all currently going, although I have seen a report from Missouri, so I think something's at least done. But I think we can get clarity about that when we speak to staff right now. Next slide. All right, so now I got a little anxious. I'm going to jump to the panelists before we're ready, but I think we're ready now. So again, for Jen in Missouri, your evaluation had an interesting combination of research questions, looking at overall impacts, as well as timing selection, and also as a cost analysis. I was curious why those research questions were interesting to you, who was involved in identifying the research questions, and what roles different people or types of people had in developing those questions?
The idea to test the impact of timing was something that just came up naturally during a discussion about what questions we might want to answer. We knew right away that we wanted to evaluate our RESEA program as a whole to help identify our pain points so we can address them, because what better opportunity could there be in regard to having solid data to utilize for program improvement than this evaluation? But unfortunately, that didn't give us what we needed in terms of completing a randomized controlled trial impact study, which is what we needed to do for evidence building purposes. So early on during a meeting that included my supervisor, who's the chief of our benefits section here at DES in Missouri, myself and our evaluators are out, getting tongue-tied this afternoon. Our evaluators, we all met, and I threw out the question of whether the first compensable week was the ideal time for claimants to participate in RESEA or not. It has long been assumed that providing services at the very beginning of a UI claim was the best, but what if at least some of the time that isn't true? When this question was brought up, Dr. Muser and his team agreed that this was a very natural question to want to answer. And not only that, but there was essentially no good evidence at the time that would allow us to really know. I would say that I was most interested in what we would find out about our program as a whole, because I'm responsible for not only keeping Missouri's RESEA program running, but for finding ways to make it better. Being involved in a continuous improvement process, having solid data to focus my actions is extremely helpful. But the timing impact question is part of that. But I would assume that that was the primary focus of our evaluators, simply because the question hadn't been effectively answered before. And also because that part of the evaluation was much more labor intensive.
No, but that does seem like definitely very practically useful question, one that we don't know a lot about. And it is a good point that, I mean, having a component evaluation, if you're conducting one and that's what you want to do, it's generally relatively, I mean, you can add a whole program evaluation and conduct it at the same time, and it's much less additional effort than the component is on its own. So it's a relatively low cost add-on usually. But thanks, Jen. Now I have a question for Kathy and Eric from Nebraska. You also had a substantial list of research questions that covered both descriptive implementation questions as well as impact questions. The implementation questions included things like how staff were assessing needs and barriers. And so I was curious why both of those types of questions were of interest and who was involved in identifying your research questions.
So before the evaluation, Nebraska's RESEA program, it had included follow-up meetings, but they were very loosely defined and not very well structured. Based on prior evidence from REA on subsequent meetings, we were interested in what the effect on our follow-up meetings was. We developed hypotheses for outcomes that the subsequent meeting might affect based on the guidance in the USDOL TEGL, detailing the 4 purposes of the RESEA program. Now, those include looking at not only does a subsequent meeting help claimants return to employment, but also do they do so at a higher wage and do they retain employment longer? And these questions would have come from Department of Labor staff, the director, and the administrator at that time. The questions relating to claimant characteristics and program implementation seem to have come more from NUPPC, our evaluator, which is Nebraska Public Policy Center, as part of the University of Nebraska. And it seems like that was more their way to understand our program and what Department of Labor was asking them to do.
Thanks, Kathy. I actually want to follow up, as long as I have you on the line here, with your strong focus on, I mean, these implementation questions that your evaluator was looking at. What were things that you learned about your program functioning along the way of conducting evaluation, and have they led to any rethinking or any program changes or considerations of program changes?
So at the time of the study, our RESEA staff was required to complete a certain number of follow-up meetings, but there was really no guidance on what that should look like or who should actually receive the follow-up service. Not necessarily a result of the evaluation final report, but maybe more learning through the process of conducting the evaluation. We have made changes on how staff conduct that follow-up and what they should be looking for. An aspect that I think we didn't ask for, but our vendor focused on was race, ethnicity, and gender.
Mhm.
And the results of that actually brought our focus to some of the more underserved communities. So that has led us to work even harder to align our RESEA program with some of our community partners who can help bridge some of those gaps. Because there is a complete change in our leadership from the time the evaluation started to its completion, I don't think that I can say that there are direct correlations from the study to the changes that we're currently working through. The focus on evidence building and the information that we've received from both USDOL and other states, it's led us to a program redesign and more thinking about how that can be evaluated. We're looking at some internal processes that can actually show a causal relationship between our RESEA program as a whole and improved employment outcomes.
No, thanks so much. I'm curious to hear more as that moves forward and what those efforts look like. Now, a question to direct to Sarah and Megan from Rhode Island about your experiences making changes during your evaluation. I mean, there was some, pre-pandemic and pandemic interruption, post-pandemic work. And so I was curious what pivots you had to make in response to those interruptions, as well as how your research questions were originally developed. Who influenced that, and how those have changed over time, if at all?
Absolutely. Quite a bit, obviously, I think for all of us changed in early 2020, and we had anticipated, being able to kind of hit the ground running, and obviously we had to make some quick pivots when the pandemic hit. But what I do think it allowed us to do is to take a little bit more time and think about some of the questions, think about ways in which we could do some kind of behind the scenes work, as we knew that our RESEA program wasn't going quite as large as it normally would because of the pandemic. We had not made it mandatory throughout the height of the pandemic, and so we were able to go back to our evaluator that we had contracted, talk to them about some surveys that they could help us craft, and then really about, let's say, mid 2021, we all got together in person for the first time in about a year. Our evaluator, our unemployment insurance leadership, workforce leadership, and talked about how we had anticipated the evaluation going, and then moving forward, whether or not those questions still aligned, given the climate, the questions about how long someone was on UI, did that work given PUA, given the extensions that we have been doing, looking at their employment rate and their wage rate. And so we decided to still keep those that we had originally crafted, but then also look at some of the timing of our participants so that we could make sure that we captured the most accurate data possible post that main pandemic impact.
Okay. And so I know it's been a lot of work. And then as you were going along, what have you learned about your program through the process so far? I know you're not like at final results of things necessarily, but as you've been going through it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we learned that I think we've all been looking at a little bit is you learn the most when you try and teach someone about a program. And so one of the things as we were, our evaluator had some knowledge of the program, but not as in-depth as we thought that they needed. And some of the things that we learned was that maybe it was a little more complicated than it needed to be as we were taking them through it. It was great to have that fresh set of eyes from an academic lens. And so we actually started doing kind of some plain language crafting from their feedback. In addition, with the survey, the participant survey that they helped us craft, we were able to start looking a little more closely at whether or not those that had been selected had access to technology, access to transportation, things of that nature, which then allowed us to let our job coaches, our AJC Center staff know, so they could offer, supportive services, have that be a transition into our adult and dislocated worker program if that was needed. So those seemingly small tweaks along the way, actually we found had a bigger impact as we go forward. And we're still using those as we craft some more language to put on our certification page, things of that nature, to hopefully increase our participation in the program.
Well, thanks so much. So Jen, what have you learned about your RESEA program to date from the evaluation that's been most interesting or useful to you? And are there ways that you've used the findings from your evaluation?
Almost forgot to unmute myself. At the time we received our first interim report, the study hadn't run long enough for our evaluators to provide a full evaluation of Missouri's RESEA program, although they were able to provide some preliminary estimates of the program's effectiveness. And those estimates confirmed that the program was successful in reducing the number of weeks claimants received UI benefits. So that was good news. At this stage, they did not see any clear difference in the effectiveness of those who participated at 2 weeks or those who participated at 6 weeks. But when the full study is completed, we'll have a much clearer picture of that. The next interim report, which we're expecting hopefully by the end of December, that will have more complete estimates of the effect of RESEA on UI benefit receipt, as well as preliminary estimates of its effects on employment and earnings. Part of the evaluation included interviews with a variety of staff from both Missouri Department of Labor and Industrial Relations Division of Employment Security, which is where I'm housed, and the Missouri Office of Workforce Development, which oversees our American Job Centers. And one of the things that came up during those interviews was that some claimants found our notification letter to be a little bit difficult to understand. This wasn't even a primary focus of the evaluation, but I latched onto that right away as something I could improve immediately. And our new and improved notification letter went into production last week. So that's something we've been able to roll with already. Something else of note is that Missouri began experimenting a couple of years ago with an RESEA virtual team. So these are Office of Workforce Development staff that are not housed within an American Job Center. They all work remotely. This team allows us some flexibility in regards to where individual staff are assigned. So we regularly assess which offices are deferring the greatest percentage of RESEA eligible claimants, and we assign virtual team staff to those locations. During the evaluation process, data was collected that showed that the virtual team was generally more successful in meeting with participants than Job Center staff. And both we and the evaluation team found this very interesting. As a result, additional staff were added to the virtual team.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, you got questions you're looking at, that you're planning to evaluate, and then you just start digging around, looking carefully at your program, looking carefully at the data, and this new stuff comes up that you didn't anticipate. That's fun to hear about. Are there also more questions that have been raised that you'd like to answer in future evaluations from what you've seen so far?
I asked Dr. Muser about this, and he said that if we had the chance to design an additional study, he would start by considering whether changing the notification letter alters meeting likelihood. It would be really easy to randomize the sending of the letter to have comparison groups. And we might build in a comparison of the virtual team with the others to see what difference that might make. And I agreed that it would be very interesting to answer both of those questions.
Right. And that is, I mean, that is a nice one to answer some of these ones that have really, like, obviously it's important to have information on effectiveness on final outcomes, on employment and UI duration. Can be a little frustrating the time you have to wait for that sometimes. So there is, it's something like the notification letters where you're looking at attendance. It's nice because you can learn some things pretty fast and sometimes iterate on what your approach is to make improvements sort of on the go. So and thinking about again, you all's experience, Kathy and Eric, from your experience, what would you do differently with your evaluation? And are there any tips from your experience that you would have for other states?
So, one piece of advice is to make sure that you focus on impact evaluation on a clearly defined and well implemented intervention. We might have had some clear outcomes if we had focused more on the initial RESEA instead of trying to evaluate the follow up process, which was not clearly defined at that time. We also jumped into our evaluation in the midst of COVID. It started gathering data in October of 2020. So there was so much that was not normal for our program at that time. Staff was pulled in to assist with conducting the follow-ups to the intervention group, but they weren't properly instructed on what the purpose was or why they were being asked to do it. So we also used a lot of staff who did not regularly conduct the RESEA meetings because our staff was being pulled in other directions. So they didn't even necessarily have an understanding of how to conduct the follow-up correctly. To be honest, I would change a lot of what we did. A lot of it being started a year later than what we did. So my first tip to other states is to not start your evaluation during a mass pandemic. But seriously, I'd say to really understand why you're conducting the evaluation, aside from the fact that U.S. Department of Labor told us we needed to, and to know what the results are that you're looking for. Setting out clear guidance to the vendor that you're working with to conduct the evaluation, and just ensuring that any staff that you involve know what you're doing and why.
I appreciate that. Those are all great points. And it does some of that about evaluating the meeting that may not be consistently defined or consistently implemented. It also can, I think, raises the potential value before you start making sure you've studied your program implementation a bit and making sure that the thing you think you're evaluating really is what you think it is being implemented like you think it is. And so it's so you know what you're getting out at the end. Sarah and Megan, you also, I mean, with your iterations that you've had, are there tips that you have for other states about planning for conducting evaluations?
I would echo some of the other panelists that I think take your time and anticipate that there are going to be delays and maybe misinterpretations. We found that the language of academia and the language of workforce often do not translate. And so we had to spend some time really setting our platform of expectations and also just definitions. That was something that we spent a lot of time on. And then if you have a state IT team that is not necessarily part of your unit, just making sure that they also have that same definition, because I think, not necessarily wasted a lot of lessons learned, but we spent quite a bit of time going back and forth between, workforce and evaluator and our IT team, for quite some time, honestly, until Megan came on and was able to be kind of our Switzerland in the middle for all of them and translate for us. So yeah, I would say that, and then also just being able to be flexible And if there are things that you see that can change, don't be afraid to change them at the time. You know, like Jen was saying, we were a little concerned with that at first. Will this impact everything? And so we had to we checked with our evaluator, but it was something where they were like, no, that's fine. We have the data. Like, if there are things that you're seeing that you can change to improve, do that now. We'll still be able to evaluate the overall impact. And that was really comforting to know that we didn't have to wait until the end to make some of the improvements.
No, that's a great point. I know that that's a question that has come up with from multiple
I would
states.
also just jump in quickly, Andrew, and say that I think it actually was a great, looking back, a great idea to do that retrospective study while the pandemic was, while we were getting through that, to begin collecting data in a randomized control trial. I think if states have the ability to look at historic data, often there are lulls in any sort of evaluation project where you're waiting for data to be transferred or data to accrue, et cetera. And being able to look at that historic data definitely gave us a lot of information about potential gaps in outcome data that we might have to grapple with in the when the results of the randomized control trial become available. So things like missing wage data records and so forth. So just knowing, being aware of that potential snag, I think has prepared us well to kind of, properly interpret the data that we are collecting right now.
Yeah, that's also an excellent point. We get a lot of start working with data, doing analyses. You think you're just going to jump into it, and then you can run into a lot of surprises of like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't what we thought it was, or what's here. So, yeah. And Jen, to wrap up, obviously states and you conduct your evaluations, you learn some things, but then you want to, you have things that you've formally learned, and part of the point of this whole nationwide evidence building work is to make sure that states can learn from one another. What thoughts have you had about how to disseminate your findings, or what things have you done already? And that could include both internally with staff in the state leaders, or across other states.
The question's a bit premature. We hope that the results in the second interim report, which we anticipate in December, will be a bit more definitive than what we currently have. I don't want to put information out there that we're maybe still kind of on the fence about or still gathering details on, because that's not really helpful to anyone.
Right.
So, I'm happy and have spoken with a few states one-on-one about the process and things that we're finding out and things that they're finding out. And I am happy to do that at any time. But as far as disseminating that in a broad way where people have access, I think it would be more beneficial to wait a little bit until we've gotten our second interim report at least.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I would. I mean, I think it's worth thinking about once you actually have final results, like who would make sense. What are the relevant audiences, and what are the best ways to reach them? But obviously, DOL is doing a lot of work on this end. I'm trying to through venues like these to facilitate peer sharing. The survey question, it was helpful to see people's responses of what they thought would be most useful in terms of things like webinars as well as short emails and things like that. It was interesting to see the popularity of that. So appreciate all of your insights. You're willing to come on and talk in this venue. I've learned a lot. Is there anything else that anyone else would want to mention in responses to questions that you didn't include before, or anything else that's come up before we let you go? All right.
Well,
Well,
Andrew,
thanks.
I would just jump in and say one more thing. From this panel, I think one thing that I'm going to take away is when you work with an academic evaluator, they are going to want to do some sort of either a quasi-experimental study or a randomized control trial if they can. But to me, I think the significant impact I'm hearing here has been largely in implementation analyses, different ways of tweaking the program itself, not necessarily looking at long-term outcomes. And I think that's really interesting, especially because it's probably far less challenging to get off the ground, easy to jump right in. So that's one thing that I'll take away from this is the value of implementation analyses.
Yeah, no, that definitely came through. All right. Anyone else? If not, then I will turn it, I believe, back over to Evan now.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you to all the panelists. I want to open it up to the audience now. We'd like to give you all an opportunity to ask questions of the state panelists. You can ask questions of Andrew from the Evaluation Technical Assistance Team or somebody from the Department of Labor. I want to remind you to please type your questions in the chat. And if you have someone in particular that you would like to respond to that question, feel free to put that in there too. We had a couple questions come in earlier that I just want to make sure to amplify. Jared had asked about that Michigan study, the behavioral intervention for emails. And I just wanted to let everyone know that that study is in the chat if you're interested. Marshall also asked about, let's see, the maximum number of weeks a claimant can receive UI. And Jen responded 20 in her state in particular. But we had a few other questions come in. And I wanted to pose this to Kathy and Eric and also Jen. Both of you are conducting implementation and impact studies simultaneously. I want to know, has that been beneficial, and if so, why? I think this is getting towards Megan's point. We're hearing a lot about the positive impacts that positive findings we're figuring out from implementation studies. So what insights has that provided you about your state's RESEA program? I will pose that to Jen first, if you're comfortable jumping in.
I'll give it a shot. I think, one of the beneficial things about running both studies at the same time is that on some things like this question of the timing of interviews, you have to wait a little bit longer to get an answer. But on the implementation study, we're getting at least some preliminary details that we can use now. So I don't have to wait until, December or until next year to utilize that information. I can jump right in and make improvements. So I think doing them simultaneously just shortens the amount of time you're waiting for actionable evidence.
That's a great point, Jen. Kathy or Eric, do you want to jump in on Nebraska's behalf?
I think on the implementation study part of it, it maybe just kind of solidified some of the stuff that we were already thinking as far as how our program was being conducted across the state. We originally were very almost siloed from region to region, and everyone just kind of did what worked for them, where we're now looking at a broader statewide kind of process where no matter who's doing something, it's going to be implemented the same way.
That's great. I have another question, and this is for Sarah and Megan. Can you discuss the choice to conduct the historical impact study? You mentioned a little bit of how it was beneficial timing-wise with COVID, but I'm curious what went into that decision and what insights have brought you about your RESEA program?
Sure. I can say I think part of it was we wanted to make sure that we felt like we needed to be doing something. Right? We had contracted these evaluators, and we wanted to make sure that we were utilizing them in the best way possible. And we also felt like, to Megan's point, this was a great, for lack of a better word, a trial run, making sure that we were able to learn from each other, learn what was anticipated. So when it was the live data, we could really hit the ground running. And I know Megan can speak a little more to some of the advantages and that we found in that from really the data aspect, because we were able to see fairly quickly that our data was not as aligned as we had hoped, and that was something that we're hoping to be able to ameliorate with the current study as well.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. And in terms of the specifics, the historic impact study did find that the selection for RESEA was associated with slightly lower wages and lower likelihood of being reemployed during the analysis period. But we also, major sort of confounder, we did find that a number of, much larger number, I think, than we had anticipated, of wage records for those selected and the control group were missing, and they were not, the missingness was not really randomly distributed. And so it was difficult for us to determine, like, is this because people moved out of state, but they became employed? Are these folks not employed at all? There's really no way for us to determine that. And because, you know, Rhode Island's such a small state, there's a lot of bleed over into other states' labor markets. And so that was, I think we had to take the findings with a big grain of salt, because we just, you know, we couldn't fully assess every participant's outcomes.
That's great. Let's see, got a couple more questions. Again, anyone have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'd be happy to get to them. We have a few moments. This question I'm going to pose to Andrew. If a state's conducting an impact evaluation and we don't find statistically significant impacts, is it still important for that state to share their findings?
Yeah, I mean, this is a common problem in academia, where studies don't get published if you don't find impacts, which causes a number of problems. That's one thing we want to do, is figure out, okay, to really know what works and what doesn't. And if you haven't seen what doesn't, then you can't really do that. You can't differentiate. And also, if you don't find statistically significant impacts, it also doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't work. Like, some things just take large samples to find impacts, and the state may not always have those samples. And so publishing the results anyway, sharing them with DOL, puts DOL in a position, or other researchers who want to do syntheses to look across the whole evidence base, that finding can still go into a meta-analysis or go into a pooled data analysis where it can contribute to impact findings. So even if you didn't find a statistically significant impact there, it can help. For example, so, like, hypothetically, you can think, oh, suppose you have like 6 small states that all conduct evaluations, and no one of the states was large enough to detect impacts. But in theory, those 6 states, if their results were pooled, could collectively find a significant impact. So yeah, it is important to share the findings, no matter what they were, and so that everybody can learn from those.
Great. All right. We have one more question right now. I'm going to pose this to you as well, Andrew. I think it ties in pretty well with what you just mentioned. So if a state is conducting a whole program evaluation now, how should we think about what makes sense for a subsequent evidence building efforts to focus on once we have finished an evaluation? So talking about building evaluations on previous work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the panelists talked about some things, which include, like, you're running this evaluation, you're going to find, either because you were directly trying to look at it or just indirectly you found it, just like, oh, there's this thing we found that is in need of improvement, or this finding that was interesting that we want to dig more into. I mean, if something is in need of improvement, you just be like, okay, now we're going to try something new, and you're going to try that new thing. Then, like we talked about, the messaging on reminders, or messaging at the top of a banner, or consistency of implementation. They say, okay, we actually want to put in responses to this, and then test how those responses are functioning. So that's one way, is just thinking about, okay, what are the things we learned that were interesting or caught our attention from our impact evaluation, and that could lead to a component to test later. Or you could also just think about one thing that you brought up, Evan, before, was that one finding, say you've got a component evaluation. So you've done your whole program evaluation, and maybe it makes sense to look at some sort of component after that, because you're not going to look at your whole program again. And there are some components out there that maybe was evaluated in one or two places, but that's, as you mentioned, not a conclusive final evidence base on anything.
Mhm.
In particular, because contexts vary, and I know states and a lot of program administrators, when they're looking at a study, it's like, okay, it was conducted in some place, but is that like my context? And so if you see, I'm, a medium-sized state in the Pacific Northwest, and all of the evaluations that are out there, there's only been a couple, and they're from, large states in the Northeast or something, or the Southeast, and you're like, okay, there's definitely value in trying to replicate it somewhere else, particularly if you've seen, like, it looks like elsewhere, this component seemed like it was effective. And so it seems like a thing that might be interesting for us to implement, but it would be good for us to know how effective it is in our context. And that's also totally something that would make sense to evaluate.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. I wanted to pose a similar question to Kathy, more specific to Nebraska. You all have finished your first evaluation for RESEA, and I'm curious, what insights are you taking from that early evaluation, and how is that going to inform any future evidence building efforts for the program?
So I think really our very early evaluation has just given us a lot of insight as to maybe how we could have done it better and different ways to look at it. We are currently looking at some, like I said, some major changes within our program that aren't necessarily a result of the evaluation, but it definitely is always there as far as some of the information that was received from the evaluation. Looking at, again, how our entire program is implemented statewide, how some of our underserved communities need to be focused on, and how we can change what we're doing to meet them where they are instead of forcing them to always come to us. So we're looking at really expanding our relationship with some of our partner programs. And then, as I said, we're kind of doing more of an internal kind of evaluation of different components of our program, so that as we're making those changes, we're really looking at the long-term impact of those changes that we're doing.
That's great. Thank you, Kathy. I have a question I wanted to pose to Jen. Your current evaluation has already completed random assignment. You're getting interim reports. And so we're really curious how your state's capacity for evaluations has changed and evolved throughout this process to where you are today. I'm sure in 2020, when these things were beginning to start, I'm sure you're at a very different place than you are now. And so I'm just curious, how is your capacities to evaluate and implement this program evolved since then?
Certainly, back when we started this, my focus was on just getting through this first evaluation. And I think a lot of us were in that boat. Not that I wasn't excited about learning more about our program through the evaluation process, but if you've never set up one of these things, it's a lot. It's a lot to learn and a lot to process. So now that we've done one, and through that process, we've come up with a couple more questions that we would really like to answer. I would like to see us do another one.
That's great. All right.
Yeah, which raises the question I think I'm curious about is, what's your, and this could be anybody from the panel, what's your all sense for ways in which your capacity for evaluation and just building evidence, using evidence, thinking about developing questions how any of that has changed through the process of your evaluation effort so far.
I mean, this isn't necessarily reflective of internal, like, agency department capacity building, but we, as Sarah mentioned, Rhode Island, we spent a lot of time with our evaluation team, sort of doing knowledge transfer, and I think that is something that you know, and this is a team that we've, you know, often works with state agencies on these types of projects. And so it would not be surprising if we were to work with them again on, you know, a similar or a related UI question. And now that they have a lot of that understanding of how to you know, how to ingest and interpret that data, I think that's just a huge step forward. So potentially evaluations down the line can take off running. So that's a good thing if you have a partner that you know you might want to, you know, work with again. And I would just say internally, you know, echoing Jen, just doing this kind of work, undertaking it definitely normalizes it more throughout the agency, and sort of, you know, makes it seem less daunting, I guess I would say, especially for other questions or other even divisions that might want to conduct evaluations.
Thank you, Megan. That's a great point. Exciting to hear that. Well, I think we're all out of questions. So I want to thank all the state panelists for providing your experiences. So thus far, we're excited to see the results of these evaluations, and we're very thankful for you coming today and sharing your experiences. I can speak for everyone here at DOL. We are very excited to hear the progress that's already been made, and we appreciate you taking the time today to speak with all of us. I am going to go, let's go to the next slide and we'll start closing things out. We have a poll coming up. Next slide. This is going to be a Menti poll, so you can just put in one word or so, but we want to know, how can the U.S. Department of Labor and the technical assistance team support your state in building a stronger culture of evidence? So we really just want to understand what is the most effective thing that we can provide at this moment. Give everyone a moment to fill this out. Seeing a similar pattern from earlier webinars seem to be coming up. Examples. State peer-to-peer, I like that a lot. And that was one of the main motivations of this evidence building week. Great. Yep, we're seeing the same thing. So examples, webinars, and peer-to-peer learning. That's great. Really appreciate you all taking time to respond to that. That's very helpful for us as we think about what's best to help support states as they're going on this journey to evaluate their RESEA program. All right, we can close that now. We'll go to the next slide. We really appreciate you all attending today and your continued commitment to building evidence base on the RESEA program. We'll hope you'll join us tomorrow for our final session of RESEA Evidence Building Week, where we'll hear about what's next for RESEA and state evaluations. At 4 p.m. today, state RESEA staff and their evaluators can join the Evaluation Technical Assistance Team for office hours to receive support with your evaluation related questions. Today's topic for the office hours is planning impact studies. States have received invitations for these office hours separately through the RESEA helpline. If you'd like the meeting invitation, please feel free to contact RESEA at abtassoc.com. And remember, we have lots of resources on Workforce GPS as well as CLEAR, and we're excited to continue to plan and implement evaluations of the RESEA program. Go to the next slide. We have some resources and links we want to make sure to share. We have the RESEA evaluation resource page at Workforce GPS. We have the RESEA evaluation toolkit, which is kind of the one-stop shop. It's a very large document with lots of technical assistance, templates, briefs, all the things you need for RESEA evaluation. And as always, feel free to contact the RESEA evaluation technical assistance inbox. With that, I want to thank you all again. We really appreciate you attending today and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow in the final session of Evidence Building Week. Have a great day, everyone.